This is part of our Museum Lyceum series of events that are aimed at grown-ups that try to interweave history with current events and other cultural things. And I'm really proud and excited to have here today Diana Perkins, who's the author of her Shetucket River series of wonderful stories about mills and people involved with mills, set in various different historical epochs throughout this whole area of northeastern Connecticut. Her most recent novel, called The Nonprofit Murders, that she's going to talk about today, she wrote as a fundraiser for the Guilford Smith Library in South Windham and for the Mill Museum, which is a really neat thing. And it's a terrific whodunit set in, I guess, the present. And it's all in Windham and Willimantic, and those of you who live in South Windham and Willimantic and know the area, if you read the book, you will recognize all kinds of places that you have been that are described very well. And Diana swears all the people are fictional in there, but the character of Sue seems really familiar to me. So those of you who know Bev York just might want to pay attention to that character when you're reading that. And her husband, Sue's husband, also will seem familiar as well. So I just want to turn things over to Diana, and you'll have a good time.
Well, I want to thank Jamie for inviting me to the Museum Lyceum. And the Nonprofit Murders was the inception. The idea of this came from Bev, of course. It was she came up with the plot idea. I told her I was going to do this novel challenge, and she said, and I said, I don't know really what I'm going to write about. She says, we had just gone through the Pajot Trust. Anybody familiar with the Pajot Trust is a lot of different nonprofits in the area can apply to this Pajot Trust, which is local, to get some kind of funding for their nonprofits. Well, Bev said, well, what if we have a murder? The nonprofits, they're all like vying for this pot of money, and it's not quite as sinister as that, but that's what it's based. That's where it came from. That's where the idea came from. So, as Jamie said, there are a lot of local places that are here, and I can't really name them in the book. First of all, a storefront changes. You don't know who's going to be there. But I do have on the back table what I'm calling the menu of different places. Each chapter had they would visit a different place. So in chapter 1, the IJ Market. In chapter 2, the brewery. In chapter 4, the shoesmith. In chapter 6, Samuel Huntington, the Harpon Church. A lot of these places are all in there. So if you pick up one of these, it'll be your menu too, and it'll make you want to eat, because I always have eating in my novels. There's always lots of eating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a reading from this. When I write, I like to write short chapters. I'm going to read the first 5 chapters. That's how short they are, and that way, as Donna says, she said I could keep on reading it, and I just kept on reading, and then I stayed up all night. So chapter 1 of the Nonprofit Murders. Now, on the front of this, a lot of my books have roads, like country roads on them. I went away from that, the one before this one, I think. This one has anyone been to the Guilford Smith Library in Windham Center? Oh, good. So you're gonna be familiar with this. This is a picture that South Windham Center. It's South Windham, right? That's right. The Windham Center is the free library.
Yeah, that's the only library in the state without a bathroom. And the one
Not this one. Not this
you're
one.
writing about is the only one with a bathtub.
With the bathtub in it. Yeah. So this actually was a house, and if you visit there, you'll see places that we talk about in the book. So I'm going to start out with chapter 1, and it is in the current time. I think it's 2014, something like that. I'm just going to tell it like it was, or at least the way I remember it, that quiet day in early autumn of 2014 when all hell broke loose in our little village. No one expected it, a murder. It wasn't a big city, it was South Windham, for Pete's sake. The The biggest thing that ever happened here was when the train hit the oil tanker and it all went up in flames. That was big, but this was different. This was murder, and not just a question of murder, but the real thing. Gruesome, bloody, and awful. Everyone knew her, the victim, Hilda Lyman. She was a mousy little thing, if mousy can describe a person. She spent most of her time at the library. She volunteered, but it was where she'd worked until she retired. She lived around a corner just a few doors past what used to be the old church. She usually walked the short distance to the library, waving at everyone, and sometimes brought her dog with her. The day it happened, he was with her, a big golden retriever named Stoker, after the red-haired Bram Stoker. She gave all of her animals authors' names. Her 2 black kittens were named Edgar and Allan after Poe. But only Stoker was there that day. Usually, after her afternoon hours at the library, she drove her ancient tan Volvo the mile to IGA Market, where she bought chicken breasts for Stoker and herself, and chicken livers for the kittens. Stoker knew it was quitting time and would often get antsy. He would pull his blanket out from under the upstairs book tables. He knew that was the first step before it was folded, and he and his gentle keeper headed out, first saying goodbye to the librarian on duty, and then walking home, where he'd jump into the Volvo and wait for the ride to IGA. Everyone knew their routine and their route. That's what made it so hard to figure out. It could have been anyone, and everyone knew her. She spent most days sorting through the donated books that would be sold at the twice-annual book and bake sales. The library, like most, was always looking for funds wherever it could find them. Generous community members usually baked for them and also donated boxes of books to be sorted into genres. So here was Hilda rummaging through the boxes, sorting them into piles. When it came to quitting time, the librarian heard Stoker upstairs above her desk scuffle around as he usually did. It sounded like he was pulling out the blanket, trying to urge his keeper into action and out of their book world into the real world. It was getting towards closing, 15 or 20 minutes past the time when Hilda usually quit. The librarian, Alice Chomsky, was finishing up her paperwork, wondering why Hilda hadn't come down yet. Just then, something dripped onto the book list in front of her. She heard it before she saw it, and when she looked down at the drop, she reflexively recoiled, almost upending her rolling chair. It was red. It looked like blood. She looked up and saw it seeping through the heat register in the old wide-board floor. 1,000 things ran through her head, all of them impossible. For a few seconds, she sat there looking from the now-growing puddle spattering onto the paperwork on her desk to the ceiling where it originated, and then she ran upstairs. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2. I know all of this because I was one of the first on the scene. They call things like this a scene, a crime scene. My old friend and collaborator called me at the paper where I was doing my usual writing headlines for the stories written by youngsters who didn't have time or creativity enough to bother doing it. I was a relic at the paper. They fired me and then hired me back for a lower salary, but I didn't care. Newspaper ink was in my blood, or at least that's how the saying goes. There's something exciting and dynamic about a paper, with its headlines, its frenetic pace. I loved it. I resented the new owner, but I understood they couldn't keep me at my old salary. So I didn't come crawling back. I just slipped into my old seat like I'd never left, and the kids accepted it. So as I said, my old friend Simon called me, and I was there before any other reporters. That's important because some evidence can get muddled or lost or mishandled. And if I can see the place before it becomes a zoo, I might be able to gather some interesting tidbits that might be lost in the later melee. We'd like to believe it was like one of those CSI crime scenes, but it's more like a 3-ring circus. And the press is in one of those rings, trying to get close as we can. The curious and concerned in another ring, and the cops in the center ring. Then the big guns come in, the state troopers, detectives, and if it's big enough, the feds. The state and feds add a whole new layer to the circus because their job seems to be able to keep everyone and anyone from getting close and knowing anything about what happened and what they'd found. Having previously been caught with their pants down, they learned to get their facts straight before the press conference, not letting anything leak out that might contradict what they'd already disclosed so they wouldn't embarrass themselves. So Simon, who like me was hanging on to his job by his fingernails, gave me a call. He knew I'd be interested and good at seeing details and picking up on nuances that some of those without as much experience might miss. Simon was a detective in the Willie police force. He'd started out 50 years ago as a beat cop when there still was such a thing. The Willimantic police didn't have jurisdiction in South Windham, so we weren't even supposed to be there, but Simon lived there, and I lived a mile away in Windham Center. This was one of our people, and we felt we needed to at least get a look before the state police arrived and shut it down. Simon had worked his way up through the ranks. He made it to sergeant, and more or less a desk job doing detective work. He said it was mostly pretty boring, going through records, trying to find information about thefts, reconstructing accident scenes, and asking for witnesses. Sometimes interviewing neighbors who might have seen a scooter go missing, or a friend who might know about a sister of a friend who might be selling drugs. Mostly dead ends, he said, but sometimes he picked up some juicy clue that would lead to an arrest. He told me most people didn't want to get involved and didn't want to tell him anything. Simon was reputed to have a good nose, but he'd passed his retirement age, and the only reason he was still there was because the captain felt sorry for him. At least that was what Simon thought. His wife had passed away about 5 years before, and everyone could tell he needed to keep his job. So he stayed in the force, doing the boring stuff that no one else wanted to do, and it helped him keep his sanity. We would occasionally go out for a few brews. The old post office that had become a brewery had turned out some pretty good ales, and we'd do a few and loosen up. He liked to sit in the back corner where he could watch the people who came in. He had a habit of, probably an old cop's habit of, keeping his back to the wall and being vigilant. While I don't think he ever pulled his gun while he was on the force, he did spend some time in the Army and saw some action overseas, but it was something he never talked about. So I respected his need to watch the people. He often leaned close and commented in a low voice about some of the characters who came parading through. So when the call came into dispatch, Simon, who was close by, called me and headed out the door. He was out before any of the squad cars could go screaming down the street, or the ambulance or the detective could collect themselves. They probably wouldn't rush anyway, but wait for the troopers to arrive and direct traffic if it was needed, and after that go back to the station. I'd been reading through articles for the paper, correcting some, seeing what clever kind of headings I could come up with for the evening. It was 4:15 and the library usually closed at 4. I jumped into my old Subaru and tried to get to Pleasant Street as quickly as I could so I could bypass some of the lights on Main. Simon must have done the same because I saw his big Ford in front of me going as fast as he safely could, but without lights or siren. I tailed him like a hound dog. He saw me and seemed to speed up. I flicked my cigarette out the window and tried to keep up with him. When we got to the library, Alice was sitting on the steps out front, holding on to Stoker's leash. Both looked lost. Stoker looked unsettled, like he didn't know if he should sit or stand or run. Alice stood up unsteadily. She was pale and had her sweater pulled tightly around her, even though it wasn't that cold. "Is anyone else here?" Simon began. Alice shook her head. No one's been here for at least a half hour or so, not since." And she put her head in her hands and started to sob. I put my arms around her and let her cry. Stoker just looked from her to me, to the door. "Where is she?" Simon said. "Upstairs," was Alice's muffled reply. We could hear Simon's way off in the distance. "Can you wait here with the dog?" Alice nodded, and Simon wanted to get upstairs before it became crazy. She pulled back and took a wadded-up Kleenex out of her pocket while we both went inside. Our eyes followed the bloody trail of paw prints, not from the entryway, not down the hall, but up the stairs. Chapter 3. I'd seen auto accidents before with bodies of people, young and old, crushed into impossible positions, but it still shocked me to see a dead person, one who I knew, and this death had just happened. Simon stopped at the top of the stairs to size up the scene and then stepped carefully into the room, avoiding the bloody paw prints, a book on the floor, and the blanket pulled out a little onto the aisle between the tables. Hilda lay on the floor with her feet facing the stairs we'd just climbed, her body towards the rear of the building. The heat register where the blood had collected was behind her head. Her skirt was just above her knees, and one hand was by her head as though holding her neck. She was lying on her side, and the other arm was stretched loosely in front of her. Other than how pale she was, she didn't look dead. Her eyes were open. The hand under her head was doused in blood. The blood pooled into her dull brown hair and oozed under a book that lay near her other hand. Some blood was also sprayed across the piles on the table where she had been working. Simon touched one of her eyelids. Couldn't be more than more than an hour, maybe less. He was clinical while I was thinking about this kind old lady who should have passed peacefully in her sleep and not died in this way. He stood up and took some quick photos with his cell phone. Take it all in, Smitty. I'll need your eyes and your memory on this one. Even with photos, a lot can be missed. I looked around. Other than the blood sprayed across the books and the blanket on the floor and the dog prints, I didn't see anything else that was odd. I bent down and then saw under the table a penknife. Skittered spots of blood trailed to where it lay. It was small. The blade was maybe 2 inches long. It was covered in blood. It was the kind that might have been used 100 years ago to freshen your quill. Simon didn't pick it up. Do you suppose it has fingerprints, he asked. At that point, we heard a commotion outside and feet clumping up the stairs. I backed towards the door, but Simon stayed where he was. Stop, he said forcefully. We need to secure the scene. This was a murder. Don't let everybody up here. We need the state troopers, their detectives, their photographers first. The men at the top of the stairs stretched to see past him, and there was some chatter up and down the stairs about backing down and waiting for the troopers. One of the officers said, So what are you doing here, Sarge? This is my library, he said sarcastically. Hey, are you guys stepping on paw prints on the stairs? He assumed control of the situation. I backed into one of the rooms at the top landing and looked around at the display cases. There were a number of photographs of historical buildings in South Windham and an open case that had some old journals with fancy handwriting flipped open to view. There were also several inkwells and quills and penknives. I took a closer look. It seemed that some things were missing. There were open spots which probably held other items. I needed to talk to the librarian about the exhibit. Did the penknife come from this case? Was there anything else missing? I heard more clumping up the stairs. One of the officers had pushed the others down, and several were controlling the front entry, letting through only those they thought needed to come in. We heard more sirens in the distance, and cars racing up, and brakes screeching, and doors slamming. A tall man in a state trooper uniform came up the stairs, looking past Simon and into the room where Hilda lay. He knew Simon, who was fortunately one of the Willie Police Force liaisons with the state police. They stood talking for a minute, nodding in agreement about something. Simon stood over to the side, watching as the trooper walked carefully around the area. Just then, a man in a Tyvek suit and booties appeared, carrying a large case, which he opened to reveal plastic bags, swabs, a flashlight, and all sorts of bottles, brushes, and paraphernalia. Another came up behind him, started snapping photos, putting down little numbered plastic tents, and snapping more photos. I tried to talk to Alice and hoped that I could discreetly slip downstairs without drawing too much attention to myself, but realized I should have done it before the state troopers arrived. I edged around the staircase banister, one of the troopers grabbed me. Hey, what are you doing here? I didn't think that saying it was my library too would fly. I was saved when Simon told them that I came with him. Well, get out of here and give your name to the trooper at the door. I was glad to get downstairs outside where the air was fresher and you couldn't smell the metallic scent of blood. I looked around for Alice and asked for her, but was told she'd been taken down to headquarters to give a statement. I saw Stoker tied to the picket fence, looking lost, and I went over to him. How you doing, fella? I knelt down and stroked his head. You were the only one to see it, huh? He looked at me with soulful eyes. Want to come home with me? I asked one of the troopers if I could take him, but he said yes, but I couldn't budge him. He wasn't going to leave, so I sat in my car and waited. I didn't know how long it would be until they removed the body, but I would wait. Hopefully Alice would be back after a while and I could talk to her. After a half hour, several more state cruisers came and more officials, and also some men in Tyvek suits. They went in, and 2 hours later the ambulance, which had been waiting, finally was able to remove the body. At that point, there were not only some of my coworkers, but also a van, lights, a satellite dish, a TV cameraman, and a reporter walking through the crowd interviewing anyone who seemed inclined to speak to him. It was getting late and I was getting hungry. I went to stand by Stoker while the body was removed and was finally able to coax him into my car. Simon came out and looked tired. We headed over to my place for a couple of beers and whatever I could find in my kitchen, which turned out to be canned refried beans and taco chips. Smitty, what did you see? Chapter 4. As I defrosted old Burkhardt for Stoker, I told Simon about the display cases in the other room and that we needed to talk to Alice. Simon pulled out his cell and started to scroll through the photos he'd taken. Oh, I forgot. Look at these footprints. They were going back towards the stairwell. We must have missed them when the officers stormed the stairs. We looked as he scrolled in to enlarge them more than life size. Who do you suppose made those? The first one was darker and more blurred, but the second one, although it was dark, was actually a pretty good partial print of what was likely some kind of running shoe. I'm not sure. I don't know if I've seen something like that before. It's not a regular brand from what I can tell. It had a strange wavy line and ending in edges that were another larger wavy line. Do you think that anyone at the shoe place on Lower Maid would know where it came from? It'd be worth a try. We'll have to have him look at it. Did you see anything else? He was probing. No. What about you? Anything else we didn't see when we first arrived? No, well, not exactly. The desk downstairs where Alice sits had a bottle of blood on it. That must have been unnerving. You were right. We need to talk to her. Maybe it's a suspicious cop in me, but we need to be sure that Alice isn't somehow involved. It was 10 o'clock and we decided to call her. She didn't answer and I left a message, and about a minute later she called back. Can we talk to you? Oh, not tonight. I took a sleeping pill and I'm hoping it'll work. Can you come over in the morning? From what the police said, I don't think we'll be opening the library a few days or maybe weeks. Sure, no problem. I have Stoker. Didn't Hilda have some new kittens? Is there anyone taking care of them? Oh, I forgot. Edgar and Alan. I'll go over and feed them. Are you sure you want to do that? Where's the key? I'll go over myself. You go see if you can get some sleep. So Simon and I drove past the library, which was lit up and still had a couple of cruisers parked in front and was festooned with crime scene tape. We found the key under the mat where Alice told us it would be and went into the dark house. The state police hadn't gotten there yet to search it and seal it with tape. It was empty except for two frantic kittens meowing and spilling water and scattering a few tiny bits left of their dried food. I bet you're wondering where your mom is, I said quietly, and I bent over to pour more dried food into their bowl. Simon went into Hilda's office, which was filled with bookshelves, stacks of books, a large desk, and he poked through the papers on her desk, open file cabinets, drawers, which were, like Hilda, neat and organized. I sat at the kitchen table petting one of the kittens that had climbed into my lap and was starting to clean himself. Who are you, Edgar or Alan? Did Hilda know the difference? Because I can't tell. But then I noticed one had a slight crook at the end of the tail, as though it had once been broken. I left Stoker in the car and wondered if he would be better off or if I should have left him back at my house. I'd given him a Benadryl, a suggestion by a vet one time when my terrier was reacting frantically to a thunderstorm. Hey, Smitty, come here. Simon called to me. Look at this. A folder he had open on the desk held legal documents that looked not only like bank records, but a will and some papers. He closed it and put it under his arm. I think this will be interesting reading. I left the kitten some water to go with the food, and then they mewed and ran around the kitchen after a catnip mouse I threw to distract them. Do you want these, or shall I go over them? Simon was giving me the first opportunity to review them. No, you see what's there. Give them to me as soon as you can, okay? I trusted him. I trusted him probably more than he trusted me, or should have trusted me. He looked hard at me. I think he's thought the same thing. Okay, I'll talk to you in the morning. I lay awake for a long time that night going over the crime scene and thinking about the life that had been ended so tragically. Who would be affected? Certainly the critters that depended on her for love and sustenance, but I guess it would also leave a hole in the fabric of the little village and of the library. How much could I or would I share with the paper? I guess there was nothing to hide, but Simon might think otherwise. Whoever did this might be watching for signs that we knew who it was and might run, or who knows what. I hated not sharing info with the paper, but knowledge is power, and we were keeping some of the power to ourselves. Chapter 5. Simon knocked at my door at 7 the next morning. Do you have any coffee? He pushed past me into the kitchen with the folder in his arm, under his arm. You look awful. Did you sleep at all last night? Just about, but it was worth it. Wait until you hear what's in this file. He opened the folder and started stacking documents on the table in orderly piles. I had to clear the table of my cereal bowl, sugar bowl, and all the other things that I ordinarily kept there just to allow him to complete his display of the evidence. Once he finished stacking, we both had Stephen cups of brew. He began to explain what was in each pile. Those, he pointed with emphasis, are Hilda's bank statements. He poked them to show their importance. She was loaded. I mean rich. I mean a millionaire. Simon was emphasizing every word. At this, I run around the table to inspect some of the papers. There are multiple accounts, so it's a little hard to decipher how much there is until you put it all together. He ticked through some of the accounts as he flipped through the papers. He sat down, sipping the coffee, careful not to drip it onto the papers. He waited, letting this sink in as I gently lifted sheet after sheet after sheet of statements and let out a low whistle as I got to the bottom of the pile. Wow, who would have known? Somebody knew. I bet Alice knew. He poked at the next pile. This is her will. I went around to the other side of the table as he started to describe what was in it. She was creating a charitable trust. There was a number of nonprofits who would benefit. I mean, a bunch of them. That's how generous she was. I started to read through the will. But here's where it gets interesting. He paused to take another sip of coffee. She had a nephew. I knew, as anyone on the fringes of law enforcement knew, that when there was a crime against a person, the first suspects are relatives. After that, friends and acquaintances. Crimes against property could be anyone. Crimes against people were usually not so random. He pointed at the next pile. So here's the kicker. That pile over there, that's the trust, which says, and don't quote me because I don't understand it all, but it says the nephew gets a small yearly stipend and the nonprofits get the rest. We exchanged looks that said it all. I think Simon started to plan. We need to talk to two people. Alice, to find out what she remembers, and also to see if we can get a sense about her. You know, if when we ask a question she trips up and changes her story at all. We need to know if she is involved in any way, and then we need to find out what she might know about the nephew. We need to talk the attorneys at Harrison's who set up the charitable trust. I'll visit with Alice this morning. You think that's okay? I thought I would be the best one to talk to her, but Simon's 6 cop sense might pick up something I'd miss. Okay, I'll call Harrison's if someone there can't see me. See if someone there can see me. He poured himself more coffee and looked around the kitchen. Geez, this place hasn't changed in years. It looks and smells more like cigarettes all the time. I cleared my throat. I need him to start my ticker. Cigs and morning coffee. And Cheerios? He bent over to look in my sink. Yeah, breakfast of champions. That's Wheaties, you moron. Who cares? I eat breakfast. What kind of grain do you have? Barley malt? I crushed out my 3rd cigarette emphatically. No, that's for lunch. So how's Stoker doing? He looked around and then saw him on a blanket sleeping next to the radiator. Okay, I guess. Still sleeping off the Benadryl. I hope Alice can find homes for the kittens. I guess I can keep Stoker for a while, but 2 little troublemakers on top of the big golden would just be too much for me. So you're going to meet Alice? So you're going to meet Alice, and I'll see about Harrison, and we can have dinner together and share what we found. I agreed. Hey, it just occurred to me, are you supposed to be getting involved with this at all? I mean, isn't this under state jurisdiction? Simon looked hard at me as though he was thinking. Yeah, it is the states, but we're so close. I mean, geez, we're almost family in this little community. Don't you think we should keep our eyes open? He didn't sound convincing as I looked down at the papers on the table and raised my eyebrows. Maybe it's just a hunch, but I'm afraid the state's going to miss something. They certainly will if we've got the evidence here. Simon's removing evidence was very uncharacteristic of him. I'm going to make copies and put it back. He scooped at the papers and whisked them away. And that's the end of chapter 5. So that's the beginning of the story. And you don't know who does it until you get pretty close to the end. And the last page, if anybody, is anyone here people that read the last page first? No? Well, I know people that do that. In my last page, which says last page here, says, for those of you compelled to read the last page before reading the book, there, you've read it. Now go back and start from the beginning and do it properly.